Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on how deforestation risk can be better managed with financial institutions. This is a finance session. This is about money. It's about a different kind of money to the one that we had in the first session this morning. This one's really about this topic that has come up over and over again about crowding in investment, crowding in finance. If you listen to the very first session where Gregory Barker was talking, Secretary of State in Britain for Energy and Climate, he talked about $100 billion being crowded in by 2020. Where's that $100 billion going to come from? It's not all coming from the public sector. It's not all coming from donors and taxpayers. It needs to also come from the financial community. It needs to come from those that hold the purse strings on many of the investments, many of the commercial activities that are happening out there in the real world. And that's what this session's about. So we're going to kick off with some discussion, helping us to articulate what does it mean to talk this language around money. How does the financial community interact with the Red Plus agenda? How does the Red Plus agenda influence and encourage the financial community to engage on some of the issues around deforestation and degradation? And what does that language look like? A lot of that language is hinged around the issue of risk. And when we talk about risk, we start talking to people who kind of work in a slightly different paradigm to, I think, many of us in this room. And maybe just out of interest, what I'd love to do is just have a show of hands. How many of us in the audience here actually work for a financial institution, fund? 1, 2, 3, maybe a few more. 1. Okay, so a handful of us do. I'm going to look to you, handful, to be our sounding board as we go forwards. Feel very willing and able to engage in this conversation with us. This is going to be a pretty interactive session. We're going to have a couple of points from each of our speakers, and then we're going to really open this up and try and have some interaction with you from the floor. So everyone, please feel very open and willing to do that. I think a couple of things on this that we wanted to emphasize as we spoke in the background and wanted to take this out with you all. When we're talking about money, we're talking not just about northern rich countries and their institutions. There's a worldwide language of finance, and I think we can tap into that worldwide language of finance. It's not just about Wall Street, it's not just about London, it's also about Beijing. It's about many other spaces and places in the world where money flows from and to. And we also want to recognize that this set of risk issues that we're going to talk about and how to engage on this, it's not the only solution. We know that this is part of a bigger equation. So part of what we're going to do is sort of narrow down and focus in on what are some of the pragmatic and real things we can do in this space, but recognize that this isn't the only way of tackling some of these bigger questions out there around RED and RED Plus. So this is going to be a practical session, very interactive, lots of questions going to and fro between and amongst the panel and with you. We want to talk about some practical things like tools and approaches that organizations are already using, what the experience of that is on the ground. And it's a real privilege for me to be on this podium with the panel that we have here in front of us. So let me first introduce all of them before we kick off into the conversation. But there's a terrific amount of experience here. Eric Walker is a senior consultant with Aid Environment Asia. He's done that for 16 or so years. He's also been working for the past 25 years on this set of issues, deforestation, forest degradation issues, predominantly out of bases in Asia. He works on how do you mobilize some of these levers around international commodity trade and finance, and how do we make that work for good. So that's Eric. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Second is Dr. Ruth Nussbaum. Ruth and I have known each other for many, many years, both hailing from a small town in England. And Ruth is a founder and co-director of ProForest. Ruth, through ProForest and outside of her experience in ProForest, worked in over 40 countries, has worked across a wide range of sectors. She's listed here. Let me just run through this. Palm oil, soy, sugar, cattle, cotton, rubber, and even mining occasionally. She's she says. She spent many years living in the rainforest in Borneo. So Ruth, welcome, and we look forward to having your experience on this podium. Third is Hilda Javan. Hilda is Chief Advisor on the Council of Ethics for the Norwegian Government, the Norwegian Government Pension Fund. And she'll tell us a little bit about what the Council of Ethics does, so I won't jump into that just now. But before joining the Council, Ruth worked as a private consultant. She also worked in the civil service in the Norwegian Ministry of Environment. She brings a lot of experience of public policy analysis, CSR, addressing these issues of corporate responsibility in a wide context. And has a critical role now on setting some standards around how the pension fund operates and some of the ethical guidelines it operates too. So welcome, Hilda. It's great to have you here. And finally, not last but not least, I always end up saying last but not least, but anyway, I know you are not least, Gabriel. Gabriel Visconti, Deputy Manager and Director for the Environmental Division in BNDES, the Brazilian National Development Bank. He's an economist. He joined the bank in 1998. Since then, he's had a variety of positions, so he talks very directly from a Brazilian financier that works in this space. So welcome, Gabriel. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to the audience for spending your time during this panel, and we can kick off. Eric, I'm going to start with you, and what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of help us to frame this debate a little bit. Tell us a little bit the normative perspective. What should financiers be doing to better take into account deforestation risks?
Excellent. Thank you, Amar. Very good morning, everybody. To start off with a little bit of background, me, my colleagues, and my partners have been trying to put out the Asian fires for the past 15 years. You may recall that in 1997-98, a huge haze episode was covering practically the whole of Southeast Asia. And lots of money was being put into trying to douse the fires on the ground. And ironically, it was found that when a fire was put out, it was back burning the very next day. And the reason for that was that basically land was being opened up, forest was being cleared and burned to develop plantations. So really, it was no use bringing in firefighters if really at the background there is another power at play. So we started looking at who are the people financing this plantation development. And this was back in 98, 99. We found that actually a lot of European banks were putting millions and millions of dollars into these plantation groups that were rapidly developing plantation land bank. We also noticed that very few of these banks actually had any policy, that they did any due diligence to check who they were financing and how these companies were developing their land banks. And that contrasted quite sharply with how these banks were beginning to present themselves to the general public in their home markets. Green financing, green development, that was extremely popular in those days. And it was a huge contrast to see how these banks were profiling themselves back at home as green and responsible, while in fact all their international investments were not subject to thorough policies and due diligence. So, of course, the financial sector, banks, institutional investors, are only one actor that plays a role in deforestation. But they play a very important role because their capital enables producer companies to expand their land banks and to get everything going. And what happens really is that forests are replaced by other crops that are considered more economical. Now, what is more economical depends on a political economy question. More economical for investors and for plantation companies, but not necessarily more economical for the people living there on the ground. And that is why we see a lot of conflicts over land, conflicts coming along with the development of plantations. To some extent, there's also some concern about REDD potentially having a similar impact on local communities. There are fears that REDD schemes would also result in land grabbing. I know that that is not the intention of REDD proponents, but there are cases where it very much looked like that, for example, in Papua New Guinea. However, there's still very little REDD funding going into forest conservation, and the bulk of capital still goes to large-scale plantation development and also mining and other sectors. Just to give you a figure, our partner Profundo recently estimated how much capital was invested in the oil palm industry since 2002 to 2011. And they estimated that the total investment ranges from 40 to 50 billion US dollars. And that is a vast amount and enables these companies to develop very, very large tracts of forest land into plantations. Now, what is the leverage that stakeholders have over these investors? The question of risk, no doubt, will be discussed this morning. But it's a very difficult thing because there's very little material risk associated with deforestation, even if it's illegal. We see very, very rarely that companies are being held accountable, that the banks are being accountable. Really, the main leverage that actors have over the financial sector is claims, policies that aim to promote sustainability, at least in words. And that is how it is. Investment policies are extremely useful, but we notice that in very few cases they are consistently implemented. Nonetheless, we really need environmental, social, and governance policies because they offer a framework to check whether or not investors are holding up to their own promises. We also need banks to do much better due diligence, to seriously look at not the company group that they are financing, some abstract holding, but the actual plantation subsidiaries that exist underneath those groups. And those subsidiaries usually operate in many different localities, and it's really necessary to check what's going on the ground if you want to make any claim about responsible investment. And in case there is no compliance, that should have consequences. And very often that does not happen either. We've seen very bizarre situations where a bank asked NGOs to please submit any complaints, any grievances about companies in their investment portfolio, but then they would not report back to those stakeholders what interventions would be taken because that fell under client confidentiality. That's really problematic, and it doesn't motivate stakeholders at all to work with an investor of that type. So long as the finance industry continues with weak implementation of ESG policies, I think we need to look at the role of governments. Governments do have a role to govern, and as you all know, they have failed pretty much in governing the financial industry, which has contributed to the US financial crisis, the European financial crisis. One can imagine the enormous challenge that we face with the ecological crisis that is being nurtured and fired up by capital investment. So we do need governments to set the rules or set the best example. And we have two people from government-related institutions here on the panel, so it's really important to hear also what they have to say. But Ruth will further elaborate. Lastly, we also know that governments are slow in moving and regulating, and it's therefore still very important that the civil society pushes the industry, pushes governments, And I would like to point to this statement that was developed by a group of NGOs in Jakarta last July. It's called the Jakarta Workshop CSO Statement on Palm Oil and Finance. Bill Barclay from Rainforest Action Network has a number of copies there with him. Bill? Yeah, so this document elaborates on what NGOs are expecting from the finance industry in relation to oil palm development in Asia.
Eric, thank you so much. That's excellent. So you've laid out a little bit of landscape for us. You've thrown a couple of challenges on the table. Ruth, let's pick up. There's little material risk in deforestation, according to Eric. Policies are poorly developed. Help us to understand, are financiers taking these risks seriously? If so, why? How? If not, why not?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So just to start off, to provide some context of how Proforest works with investment, because I think it also helps a bit to lay out the wider framework of all the different flows of investment there are. So we work with helping the private sector implement sustainability in the natural resource sector, and we work with production companies, we work with supply chain companies on responsible sourcing, and we work with investment. And investment covers many things. So there are, of course, the obvious big private banks and also the multilaterals. But there's also often investment from national governments. A lot of money, and we'll hear more about that, goes from governments to its own agricultural sector. There are private funds, and also certainly in the agricultural sector, there is a lot of money in the companies themselves. So everything from big oil palm that Eric was talking about, who have money to invest, to the big traders like ADM and Cargill and Bunge, who for years and years have been pre-financing many of the annual crops which are produced. So the range of investment money is very wide, and the way that all of those different groups perceive deforestation as a risk or, on the contrary, as a benefit varies very widely. And so perhaps before I talk about how I think they perceive and deal with risk, I also wanted to say, no, we've worked with investment companies now for 15 years, I guess, and also with the companies who want the money from the different investment sources. And I think based on that, it's important to say that it does make a difference. I think that where investors care about deforestation, and I'll talk about why they do and don't in a minute as you asked, but I think it does make a difference for a variety of reasons, and partly because, in some cases, as Eric already said, if there is no money, a bad project may not go ahead, and you may not have deforestation as a result. So that would be one direct way. But also, our experience has been that one of the things that really elevates the issue of deforestation or any other issue to a senior level in a company or even to the boardroom is if the investors are talking about it. So if a bank says deforestation matters, then the board thinks that deforestation matters. And that can be quite important in terms of getting the issue on the agenda and starting to seriously think about how to deal with it. And similarly, it gives ammunition to the people in companies that want to try to make sure that their activities don't damage forests. My experience over 25 years now has been that the majority of people don't want to do bad things, that they are put in positions where that's the way that business is being done. But if they have an option to do things better, they will often take it. And it helps to contribute to a level playing field, as we've heard in some of the other sessions, for companies trying to avoid deforestation, to have deforestation-free supply chains. If they have to compete with others that are not deforestation-free, that makes life more difficult. So it matters. So going back to the question of investment, first of all, there is exactly the issue that Eric already raised, that for as those of you who work with investment know, and the primary risk for investment is that you don't make a return on your money. So that's what you're mostly looking at. And in many cases, it's quite hard, or we found it quite hard to make it a case that deforestation is going to directly stop you making a short-term return on money. And so generally, it's much more about either long-term sustainability, so for people who are involved in longer-term investment, it can matter, or it's reputational risk and ability to do business, or engaging with government policy, and again, the issue, or the point that Eric raised. And another very important thing that's kind of related to that is that deforestation is not the only social or environmental issue which investors need to think about. And so here we are in an environment where we are thinking a lot about deforestation, but there are other big meetings and places where people are equally concerned about labor rights or the role of women or about food security or many other issues. And so for anyone who has to make an investment policy, you need to work out how to put together all of those different social and environmental issues into your risk portfolio, and that complicates things. It makes it more difficult to do. But nevertheless, many people from big banks to multilaterals to national pension funds or national development banks have thought about it and do have policies. And so then once you have a policy, the next challenge is how you implement it. And I think there are two kind of challenges in particular that, at least for us, that we've come across. So the first one is that there is often a very great distance between the rhetoric and the policy making at headquarter levels and the reality in operations, whether it's for the lender making a decision in a local branch of a bank or a local in a country far from headquarters about whether or not to provide financing, or whether it's a company that has been financed actually implementing their policies on deforestation on the ground. So there's often a big gap, and sometimes that's a lack of training. It's often a big problem about the incentive profile that people are given. So very often people who lend money have KPIs, key performance indicators, they're judged on about how fast they get money out of the door and how much return they get on the money. They often don't have KPIs about whether or not that causes deforestation. So even if there is a policy, they are not being rewarded for implementing the policy. They are being rewarded for implementing, or it's a perverse incentive really. They are being rewarded much more if they make a lot of money than they are if they avoid deforestation. So I think that's something that's very important, is looking at how in practice, how are people implementing policies even if they have them. And the second thing is that especially in big financial organizations, there can be big variation even within the organization. And perhaps a story of something that happened to us is an interesting one to illustrate it. We were working with one of the large international banks on their policy for forestry and agriculture, and there was a lot of enthusiasm going right up to the very top of the bank about we need to take deforestation seriously, it really matters, let's put together a policy, think about how we implement it. And my husband works in environmental finance, and I was walking past his desk and I noticed that there was an analyst report from the same bank, and so I picked it up to look, and it was from the Southeast Asia bit of the bank. And basically the analyst was saying oil palm investment may become less attractive because, rather strangely, they are saying that they're no longer going to deforest, and that will reduce their land bank accessibility and make them less valuable. So the same bank was talking about things in a very different way, and of course the legal structure means that actually the people in headquarters can't tell the analyst, don't say that, because the analyst is not allowed to be influenced by the rest of the bank. And so you have very complicated things even within an organization that is already thinking at quite a sophisticated level about what to do. So in summary, just to say, no, overall, our experience has been that it matters what the finance says. When finance, whether it arrives as a huge investment for a new project, or it's simply a financing facility within a bank to help you pay your wages every month and cover cash flow. If it arrives with something that says deforestation is a bad thing, that makes a difference to the way people perceive the issue internally in companies which are either producing or buying commodities. But there is a huge variation across the financial sector in what money is saying as it arrives. And I think we have to recognize both that and the fact that it's difficult to implement, even where you begin to think it's a good idea to do it.
Great, Ruth. Thank you again very much indeed. So again, what you've done is you've helped us to get a little bit of a grip on reality here. You've laid out that the risk dimension plays out in a number of different ways, and it's one component of a very complex set of arrays that a financial institution will look at when it's thinking about making an investment, either a project finance investment or an acquisition, or what that might look like. You said there's a big distance between policy and reality in many of the cases where this is trying to happen better. And ultimately, until we start talking the language of how does this impact the return that gets made on money that's invested, the materiality question keeps coming up, right? So, Hilda, what I'm going to do is ask you to talk a little bit about the role that you have in the Ethics Council. Talk about this gap between the policy and the reality. I think you operate in trying to close some of that gap and help us to understand this space a little bit better and be practical. Give us some examples of what works, what doesn't, why.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try, and good morning. I think before going into the discussion, it's quite useful to say a few words about the pension fund and our role, as you said. So the Norwegian Government Pension Fund is a sovereign wealth fund. It's invested in equity, bonds, and real estate, and it is currently a shareholder in 8,500 companies worldwide. It is owned by the Ministry of Finance on behalf of the Norwegian people, and it's managed by NBIM, which is the investment management arm of the central bank. The Council on Ethics is not an investor, just to be clear. It's an independent advisory body that makes recommendation to the Ministry of Finance to exclude companies from the pension fund or place them under observation. So the Council makes its recommendations after carrying out very concrete assessments of a company's activities against the ethical guidelines for the fund. And companies can be excluded if there is an unacceptable risk that the company contributes to or is responsible for serious human rights violations, severe environmental damage, or gross corruptions. So that's the guidelines. And then it's the ministry that decides whether to exclude a company or place it under observation, because they are the owner of the fund. But both the ministry decisions and our recommendations are published. And our recommendation is not just an email to the ministry and say, hey, we think you should exclude this company. It's actually a report on the company, can contain 10 to 20 pages about facts about the company, our findings, the council's assessments of the company's operation. This report is, of course, also sent to the company before we send it to the ministry, so they get a chance to comment on it and provide any information they like. So our work on deforestation and tropical forests started about 4 years ago, because we found that the degradation and deforestation of tropical forests may cause severe environmental damage, and as such be inconsistent with our guidelines and lead to the exclusion of companies. So we started with identifying all the companies in the fund which were involved in logging or plantation development in Southeast Asia and Africa. We wrote to the companies, we requested information on their environmental impacts of the operations. We requested environmental impacts assessment, social impacts assessment, high conservation value assessments, maps where the concessions were located, whether the concessions were covered by forests or peatland. Some companies did not respond. They simply never answered us. Some provided very limited information and said, okay, just have a look at our website. All you need is there. And some submitted full reports and tons of documents and really good quality reports. And based on this information from the companies and our own research, and we have carried out field visits, we use satellite images, we use a bunch of local consultants and experts in this area, we have tried to find out what is the reality in the individual concessions and assess the environmental damage. And then you probably ask, okay, what is environmental damage? We consider, we assess and emphasize the scale of the damage, whether the damage has long-term or irreversible impacts, whether people's livelihoods, our health are adversely affected, what the company has done to prevent and mitigate impacts, and future risk. Will these operations and practices continue into the future? Because we do not punish companies, so to say, for what actions happened in the past. This is a risk assessment, so we look forward. And moreover, our focus is on forests, not only primary forests, but also secondary forest and peatlands. We emphasize again the scale of the clearing, to what extent the company's licensed area overlaps with areas of important ecological values, which consequences the conversion of forest will entail for endangered species and their habitats, as well as the company's actions to mitigate impacts. Are the measures sufficient to maintain important values in the concessions area, we ask ourselves. So we do not assess carbon, but we do assess biodiversity. And the lessons learned. Some companies manage their operations well in terms of mitigating biodiversity loss and are willing to provide reliable and good information. So these companies really have a deep understanding what's going on of the ecological issues involved, and they are willing to mitigate those and do their best. But many companies don't. We have found illegalities, such clearing outside concession borders, HCV areas have been cleared, river buffers have been cut, and peatland is developed. And I have a slide. Maybe you can put this on. This is a slide of a logging area in Sarawak. It's a listed company which claims to abide the laws and apply sound and sustainable forest practices. So what you see is the yellow, light yellow parts is where there are logging roads, is where logging has occurred, and of course the landslides. And one of these landslides is then visited in a bigger picture or a close-up on that slide. So these companies claim to have sustainable forest management practices. We say that they don't. And the practices, what we see, as the other ones also have pointed out, are inconsistent with the company's own statements on sustainability and CSR. The actual situation on the ground is very different from what the company wants us to believe. We assess the ethical risk. We do not assess financial risk. But I think it's pertinent to ask whether, for instance, this incident here, is this a financial risk? I'm not sure. It depends on the market and how important reputation is for the company and where the company seeks finance. But hopefully, changes in societal attitudes and business attitudes over time will make an ethical operation a financial risk or a risky business. But this requires that investors are able and willing to ask the right questions, that they have knowledge and competence to assess the company's answers. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, Hilda. That's really excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And again, what you've helped us to do is really catch some practical reality here. You've given us some criteria to hold on to. You've helped us to unpack a little bit this idea of reputation risk that Ruth brought up. You've talked a little bit about the signaling function. The signaling function, I think, Ruth, you also brought this up. Eric, you did a little bit as well. That when the market signals or receives a signal that this might be a reputational issue, it sounds to me like the Ethics Council sends that signal in some respects around a set of issues here, and that translates into a risk, right? Or it can be interpreted as a risk by those in the financial community and therefore by those that operate. So we've started to sort of elaborate two sets of things here. One is access to finance, and how does deforestation play into access to finance? A second thing, Ruth, you talked about this, access to land. You gave that very nice example of seeing the analyst report sitting on the desk there. And if deforestation is not happening, then does that mean there's less land bank? And access to land is an issue here, and it's kind of complicated in the way that we've brought this up, but I think we can start to see some ways through this. Let me now turn to Gabriel. Gabriel, talk with us a little bit about unpacking these issues a bit further. Talk with us about your perspective. You are within BNDES. You're part of the decision-making that happens in BNDES around which investments to support or which investments not to support. Tell us a little bit about how you go about doing this and what role does deforestation risk play in those kinds of decisions?
Okay, thank you, Omar, and good morning, everyone. Please, if you could not understand some of my words in my English, let me know.
Oh, I should have said we just all need to go very slowly, including me.
Yeah, slow is better. So better for the translators. Yeah, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the bank. I think it's important. The Brazilian Development Bank is 100% owned by the state. It's a public bank. So we are very close to the federal policy, and many times we subsidize the design of the federal policy. That's very important for us to reduce the gap between the design and the policy and the plan. So what Ruth there have pointed is a crucial thing, not only for BNDES, I think for the government as a whole. So we are a very huge bank. I'm not comparing to World Bank. We are bigger now. But I'm humble, so one of the biggest in the world. Like 368 billion of assets last year. Disbursements last year, 2012, almost $81 billion. For this year, it's pretty much the same or a little bit more. But we took place not only in the design, but also in the implementation, and that's mostly our job of the policy. And I'm talking about industrial infrastructure and, of course, environmental and social policy. That's our job. And I think one of the best examples we have today is the Amazon Fund. And again, I think it was explored in other sessions, but the Amazon Fund for us is very, very important. It's one of the best, maybe the best example of red fund in the world. And we are very proud to be responsible to manage the resource. Brazil is very proud. It's a fund that not only works for the bank or for the Brazil, it's for the world. So we are very grateful, and we thank a lot Norway to believe in the bank and in Brazil to took this tough task and this job. So the fund itself, it's transformed a little bit the way that BNDES works. I think it's a good example of how the communication, the transparency, the social and environment indicators can evolve inside the bank. I think we have a new drive inside the BNDES related to the Amazon Fund. And we have a plan of products. I don't want to mention every product we have here. It's like 43 products in our portfolio, and just approved on the contract, we have more than 90 products in the whole portfolio. It's a lot, but we have good examples. For instance, the Brazilian Forest Service, we have a very important job. It's a big inventory of the whole biome. and another one is the international product with the other countries in the boundaries of the biome, the 9 countries, including Brazil. They are a monitoring control product. That's to avoid deforestation, to combat deforestation too. But that's I love the Amazon Fund, so I try to to talk a lot about this. But I have to talk about the bank. So regarding to the deforestation risk embedded in the products that require financial support from BNDES, we use a specific set of environmental assessments. Just for everyone knows, each product that are presented to BNDES for a primary analysis, a primary environmental analysis, we try to design a kind of grades like ABC or 1, 2, 3. And what it means is that the higher the grade, the higher the impact, the higher the risk, the environmental risk. Of course, the deforestation risk is inside this letter or this number. And the more the higher the risk, more recommendations the products will have to be followed by the analysis group. That's one thing we do. The other thing we use the license process, the environmental license process in Brazil is very comprehensive. It includes social, environmental, cultural, indigenous rights too. And so these reports are the base of our work. But we are doing more than this. We have some new approach, some new tools to try to change the mindset of the BNDES employees to look to around the big products and go further into this kind of risk. But I don't think you want me to explore these tools right now.
Put your finger on for us the deforestation risk. So you say it's a component of this wider risk analysis. And I think this echoes something that Ruth said a little bit earlier as well. But tell us a little bit about how do you look at that deforestation risk?
Okay. Of course,
how do you characterize it?
Depending on the product, we have small, medium, and big products. Mm-hmm. The big ones, of course, that most of the time they presented the most deforestation risk. So what we do, we try to put a specific recommendation to the analysis group, and this group is going to follow this recommendation and work with the company and try to avoid any kind of deforestation risk related to the product. And if you see that this risk is not going to be evaluated by the company, we stop the analysis and try to interrupt the product. But of course, there are products that they are allowed to cut some native forests. That we have a new forest code, and Amazon Fund is important too. That we have a new tool inside the forest code. That's the rural environmental register. It's in Portuguese it's CAR, C-I-R. It's a you don't have to understand it, but it's important for us. That's a kind of a classification of all the rural properties in Brazil, small ones, medium, big ones. They have the states have to construct a kind of system, and there is a federal system that they have to join the system. So we try to attach our analysis with the federal system too, and we use we were learning from the Amazon Fund to the rest of the bank. So of course there are I mentioned other tools to you, but we try to reduce sometimes when you see that the risk is higher, and or another example, if the risk is not so high and the company has a good behavior related to the environment and social issues, sometimes we can reduce the interest rates. So it's a kind of incentive to be a better company in relation to the environment as a whole.
Okay, this is really important. So you're putting your money on the table, and you're saying if a client company manages social environmental manages this set of risks well, we're as BNDES we're willing to make money cheaper to those companies.
Exactly.
because they're managing the risk, right? So you're pricing the risk.
Yeah, just not only related to the
really
one kind of capital.
Yep.
We analyze the whole set of capitals.
Of course.
Environmental, social,
right.
innovation, technology, corporate governance. And
terrific. Okay, look, I'm going to pause there, well, not pause, I'm going to open it there and get some interaction from our audience and see if we can get some to and fro. I still have many, many questions. I know that some of our panel members want to ask each other questions as this goes forwards, so we have plenty to go from, but I'm sure there are people in the audience and I want to bring you in. So I see a hand already. Well done. Let's go ahead. If you could pass the mic back there and then we'll start having some conversation here. But thank you so much, Gabriel. That's terrific.
Thank you. I think that was very enlightening in terms of what not to do. Instead of don't, careful, it's going to destroy this. It's going to have these deforestation things. I would like to hear the opinion in terms of what about ecosystem restoration program? What about if I am creating a company to do ecosystem restoration, which is actually pro the restoration of the forest. Instead of deforesting, is perhaps reforesting on other things. Definitely there will be a lot of social and environmental positives, and maybe some questions in terms of the economic safeguards. Has there been any thought in how to go about that? Like for instance, we're talking about the pension fund. Is there any incentive for the pension fund to put investment into ecosystem restoration project, because that will be the driver for REDD+. Thank you.
Fantastic. Let's take a couple of questions in from the audience. This is a really good point. What about the positive side of the risk equation? What about the opportunity side? Where are we creating incentives to promote afforestation or promote activities that really value ecosystem services? So I see two hands, one there and then one there, and then we can go from there. Oh, I'm just being reminded by my excellent panel. Could you please identify yourselves and tell us who you are as you make these comments?
Doug Boucher from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I have a question for Hilde Girban. Why do you assess biodiversity but not carbon? It would seem that carbon is easier to assess by remote sensing, doesn't require the expertise and the on-the-ground visits, and in terms of risk, that it represents indeed a global risk, including to the people of Norway.
Great, thanks, Ted. That was exactly a question that I had, so you've just ticked one off my list now, and there's one more there. Let's just do these three, and then we'll come back.
Thanks. Ian Henderson from UNEP Finance Initiative. This is more a comment that links to a report that Deutsche Bank Climate Change Advisors produced in June last year that I think is very interesting. And I think generally if you talk about SRI, most people's opinion is that there have been very mixed results. But this report, and I've just pulled it up here, is very interesting because what they do is they disaggregate SRI, and they actually say there are 30 or 40 different strategies. And they're mixing the kind of the old school SRI, which was exclusionary and very negative, with more modern thinking, which is very best in class. And they looked at, I think, over 100 academic papers. And I think what's really interesting is they're saying here, 100% of the academic studies with high rankings of ESG have a lower cost of capital and outperform on a market basis. That's not to say SRI funds capture that performance, but basically the companies are outperforming and they've got a lower cost of capital. And so it links back to a whole bunch of points that the investors have made. But it seems to me that that's a body of work we really need to focus on because, you know, lower cost of capital, that's an issue that lands directly on the CFO and CEO's table. And similarly, it's something investors should really care about. So it seems like there are some, you know, if we're a bit more nuanced about some of the research we do and empirical evidence, there could be some interesting levers we could try and exploit.
Fantastic, this is a great point. Okay, so we have a set of three there. One directly to you, Hilda. Why don't you take that now about biodiversity versus carbon? Surely carbon's easier.
Sure. Well, it's actually because of our mandate, and within the mandate of the council, there one of the issues we really have to clarify is the link between the company and the environmental damage taking place on the ground, or the norms, or the human rights violation. So the company must. We must see if we can blame the company for the damage, with regard to carbon and climate change, is the cumulative impacts. So no single company is responsible for the climate change. It contributes, more or less. So that's the reason why we have not looked at carbon or assessed carbon, because we do not think that this is within our mandate to do so. But there are discussions within the Council how this could be approached, because it's almost 10 years ago when the ethical guidelines were developed, and there's been a huge development with regard to climate change during these years. But that said, it's also important to know that the central bank, the investment management, they also have to apply ethical guidelines, and climate change is part of their ownership, as an issue which where they engage with companies on.
Great.
So,
Hilda, thank you, and I think you've hit that on the head. There's these points that have just been made about the positive side of the fence, the lower cost of capital, the SRI. Ruth, I'm going to pass this out, and Ruth and Gabriel are going to ask both of you a little bit about this. But Ruth, you've talked in the background around this a lot about how getting information up into that board level, into decision making, so that you see studies like this out there. If the implication is we're going with the flow, this is a positive force, that there are very good reasons for businesses to be electing to make decisions that promote afforestation or positive investment in the climate change debate. Why is it not getting through?
I'm not sure if I'm absolutely the best person. We need a few people that make decision about where they get money from. But I guess my observations, and it's from a distance, is that when people are looking for money, there are a range of things that they look for, and so the cost of capital is very significant. But also the cost of having the capital is significant. And there are certainly some companies I know that, for example, are now uncomfortable with funding from IFC, for example, your World Bank agency, because there are so many conditionalities and it's so complicated to have the money that eventually they come to the conclusion that it's cheaper to have more expensive money. You pay more interest, but you have to do less to prove that you're doing the right thing. And there isn't a shortage of money at the moment. I think we were talking about it among ourselves, and all of us are seeing that where people have something that looks like it's got reasonably good returns, there's money, and some of the money really doesn't care how you make those returns.
So there's still a case to be made. Money is cheap. There's plenty of it. Let's turn to you, Gabriel. You've talked about reducing the cost of capital based on some criteria for sound social environmental management. So you're singing the same song here. Are you seeing results? Does your portfolio where you do this help you to make the case to your board, to your senior leadership, that by doing this, you're making money better, you're running a better business?
I have to be honest, we don't have so many cases like this. That's the truth, but we are evolving. So regarding to the agro-system, systems, for example, we are working now with a private equity fund. It's not from Brazil, trying to identify some good examples to put money from, not only from BNDES, but from the private sector, of course. That's one thing. We're trying to integrate the forest with some cultures, and that's the best way to preserve the forest and to have a sustainable use of them. And we have some products not only to the private sector, but also NGOs inside the Amazon Fund. But we do have other biomes in Brazil, and we did 3 years ago a public call to the NGOs, mostly in states, trying to restore Atlantic forest. Atlantic forest, it's almost like 85% is degraded, fully degraded. I'm not asking Norway, another fund, please. nor is like just the Amazon. But Atlantic forest is very important for Brazil too. And we have very good products, but you know, it's a donation too. But now we have a specific line, a specific program, and we use a very low interest rate, trying to convince the private sector that deforestation is not good and restoration is very good. And restoration you can have a good return, not only in the image of the company, but even talking about business too. I think that's the best way to convince the private sector to do this. And when you convince the private sector, you convince your board and your direction. So we have one good example. A private company, big private company, decided part was a compensation, okay, but part was voluntary. And this company is doing an effort to restore like 20,000 hectares of the forest. So it's a huge product.
Okay. So I'm hearing a couple of things now as we go through, and Eric, I'm going to bring you in a second because I know you want to add to this debate. Going with the flow, picking up the positive, the importance of that signaling function as well as identifying the risk or the negative aspects of this, equally important to bring people into this debate, bring financiers into this debate. A question, I think a practical thing starting to bubble up around awareness, and maybe something that comes out of an output of our session as we think about this going forwards, bringing awareness of that information. Gabriel, you're saying that, okay, we've got a few projects, we're starting to demonstrate some successes, but maybe we don't have the big database that might be out there. So getting some of this information up to decision makers and helping us to make the case, both on the positive side and the negative side, I think is something that we're starting to hear. Eric, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, generally speaking, the good and clean and green money does not yet manage to find the companies that are switching to sustainable practices, especially in emerging markets. I've come across cases where a bank was investing heavily in a pulp and paper company that was causing a wide range of problems, and that was causing even the bank to start court cases against this pulp producer. And but they were so tied up, they had to put money into this company. Well, on the other hand, there was another company that had switched to FSC certified forestry in Brazil and was actually looking for capital to make it work, to finance their sustainable operations. And the same bank said, yeah, we can't do that. It's too small a company and it's not going to happen. So I think there's plenty of examples of that type. SRI funds generally do not focus on emerging markets, where of course most of the development and most of the deforestation happens. As for ecosystem and restoration, Hero, I think perhaps you could also look at industries within Indonesia who could contribute to ecosystem restoration. For example, the RSPO has a mechanism that will request its members to compensate any accidental forest clearances and accidental environmental damage. And they will be looking for land and projects to put their money into to do this compensation. So I think maybe commercial banks may not be the first target there, but for ecosystem restoration, you might want to have a look at the industry operating in Indonesia itself.
So we have a job ahead of us, Eric, of finding ways of getting good and clean and green money to find the right opportunities. Any other questions from the audience? Any more engagement? Let's start here, and then we'll go towards the back. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Nils Ranum, working for the Rainforest Foundation in Norway. And we have worked for many years with the Norwegian Pension Fund, and it's important to note that there has actually been quite a few improvements, important improvements related to this, which is one of the world's largest investors, as Hilde pointed out. And just let me start with a quote from the former finance section where Ariel Engelsen said that projects win battles, policies win wars. I would say policy implementation may win wars. And it's a question for Hilde, because you have made several important divestments from single companies, like Malaysian logging companies. But I think that to solve this problem, we need to improve the practices of all the finance institutions. And have you considered looking more holistic on this, that finance institutions providing funding for environmental destruction or human rights violations, where if banks or other investors don't have sufficient policies in place to avoid being a part of this destruction, that you should actually recommend divestments from these finance institutions. Just as an example, Norway divested from the logging company Samling several years ago, but Norway still invests in, for example, HSBC, which is the bank providing finance for Samling. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Two more at the back, and then we'll...
Hi, Ruben Lubowski from Environmental Defense Fund, EDF. My question is about, in the future, if we're really serious about addressing climate change, this presumably means that there will be some carbon price or regulations that will apply a penalty on high carbon investments. So how do we think from a financial risk management perspective about the fact that investments in high carbon assets might be stranded or lose value in the future if there are carbon regulations and the world becomes more carbon constrained? So how do we think about that sort of negative or implicit carbon penalty on the one hand, and on the other hand, how do we think about investments that might have greater value if carbon regulations get stricter? For example, how do we think about investments in red or other assets that maybe have value, and how do we think about that maybe having a risk hedging value against the other investments? How does that factor into financial risk management?
Excellent, thank you. One more at the back there. There was a hand up, yeah?
Hi, Joel Paik with the Nature Conservancy. I have a question. We've begun to do some work with the reinsurance industry on adaptation finance, where the case can be made about the economic value of healthy ecosystems preventing against storm surge, a healthy mangrove compared to gray infrastructure. And by working with the reinsurance industry, getting the cost of those risks into the back end. We've heard a lot about getting this cost into the cost of capital, but do any of the panelists know about other avenues for working these costs into the total financial picture other than just the cost of capital?
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a set of questions here. Hilde, you have one specifically, so let me just turn to you and have you respond to that directly.
Have we assessed banks? This is a very difficult question. And again, I repeat a little bit what I said previously, is that there has to be a clear link between the violations going on the ground and the company in question. With bank, there's more, it's more a supply chain issue. I mean, they provide finance for the company and the company is doing the violations. And with banks, it's all, and with regard to finance, it's often very difficult to isolate what they're financing. If it's project finance, I mean, we are going to develop this plantation, we need financing for that. We could consider it. I don't know what the conclusion would be, but still, the council is very concerned with that there shall be a clear link between what's going on the ground and the company. We could blame the company. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilde. Now, there's two questions there, and I'm going to split them between Eric and Gabriel. Eric, can you take this last question that we had about the sort of wider financial package? You can kind of look at cost of capital issues, but I think this question was basically saying, how do we bring this set of issues, these risks and concerns, into the wider understanding amongst financial institutions about the role they can play in the space? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. Gabriel, the question that I'm going to ask you to pick up on is this idea of costing the future. looking at a low carbon intensity future and how that gets costed or taken into consideration. Eric, are you ready to shoot off first? And if you feel stuck, feel free to pass it on to someone else on the panel. Go ahead, dude. Go ahead, Gabriel. I'll give Eric a bit more time to think.
Eric was going to think about his answer. So.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, I'm going to explore a little bit more the tool that we have to evaluate not only the product, but the company. That's the key, I think, to answer your question. Of course, BNDES and every bank do this. We see the payment capacity of the product. We do a very detailed analysis of the product. But we are doing, from the last 5 years, and it's evaluating and getting better. Now this kind of evaluation is now we look to the company or to the group of the company. So we try to identify the intangible assets of this company, like governance, the innovation capacity, the treatment of how they treat the human resource policy. And we have 6 capitals. One of them is environment and social. So what does it mean? If we do a very good analysis, we are able to identify which companies has a potential sustainable growth to the future. And these companies, this analysis is the base for the risk analysis or the BNDES. So we're trying to join the quantitative part with this qualitative part. And the final grade, if the company has good capitals, good intangible capitals, the final grade is very, can be reduced, can be lower than the company that demonstrate risks in one of these capitals. Of course, environment and social is very important. So this whole package is the final packages we have. Maybe if we are good in this analysis, we are able to identify and to pick that this company has a future, a potential future, and can grow in a sustainable way, and the other one, no. That's the way we're trying to do. It's not easy. We don't do it for every company and every product, but for the big ones, the most important, we are trying to do this kind of evaluation.
Great, Gabriel, thank you. Eric, you have anything to add?
I will try. If environmental risk does not translate into material financial risk, I think there's no other option but to consider those other risks, ethical risks, or to frame them in a context of an ethical policy. And that is why I can appreciate so much what the Ethics Council of Norway is doing. It is independently checking whether or not the pension fund is supporting deforestation or other damaging activities that for the producer company are not real risks in the sense that they would be legally liable for deforesting land. So I again repeat that we really need governments to set out those frameworks, and maybe we should move forward from national level to international level, because capital is global and it's very fast, and we need a framework that that captures the basic ethics, and perhaps this is something that could be framed in an USO network, USO framework, and of course the World Bank has its frameworks as well. I think they can all be tightened up more, and accountability needs to be much better, but I think we need to look at that level, international level.
Okay, again, back to this idea of where does the signaling come from to establish the kinds of baselines that people can use on a more consistent basis to talk about risks in their supply chains or in their investments. Ruth, do you want to add anything at this stage? I can open it up again. Okay, that's fine. There was a couple of hands over here that I saw earlier. There's one back there. And then, wow, okay, we have a lot now. Let's take that, and then we'll come back here.
Thanks. Duncan Brack from the UK. I'm an independent researcher, associate with Chatham House and Forest Trends. The first two speakers, Eric and Ruth, talked primarily about private sector sources of finance. But I wondered if it is generally the case that public sector sources, including things like export credit agencies, multilateral development banks, sovereign wealth funds and so on, tend to be better at assessing forest deforestation risk.
Thank you. A couple of questions here that I saw. Sorry, can you put your hands back up? So there's a row of three here. Let's just do these three plus that one, and then we'll try and cycle back. I know there's folks in the back as well.
Hi. Do you want me to stand up? No. Andrew Mitchell from the Global Canopy Programme. I thought I would mention an initiative that's quite relevant to what people are talking about in case people haven't heard of it, which we launched with UNEP-FI at Rio last year, the Natural Capital Declaration, which is a roadmap for the financial sector to account for natural capital in their investment and lending decisions. 45 CEOs have signed up to this from major financial institutions around the world, precisely to try and develop the methodology which will allow them to assess natural capital risk, if you like, and in this case forests in their supply chains. And Heidi's quite right, there is a supply chain risk, and it's very difficult for financial institutions because if you're lending to another institution, and possibly that's lending further down the track. But really it's no different, I think, from the corporate sector, which we also work with on these supply chain issues, is the extent to which, how far down your supply chain you go. The corporate sector says, well, right back to the farm, ideally, then you have full chain of custody. We're a long way from that in financial institutions. So I guess my question would be to the panel, to what extent in their work with financial institutions have they felt that they really understand the kinds of risks that are being run in their portfolios, and to what extent what they really want to see are the opportunities for change. The big missing piece here is the business case for change. Actually, trashing forests and making money is a really good business case, which is why everybody's still doing it. And the reverse is not yet well made. So how do we make that business case for change?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jan-Willem van Gelder. I'm from Profundo Economic Research Consultancy. We work for NGOs. We have been working the past 15 years, among other things, on the financing of the palm oil sector. I wanted to make a comment based on what Hilde was saying on the role of banks and how to look at that. What we have been seeing in this palm oil sector, and also more in general in other commodity-based sectors, is that 15 years ago there was a lot of project finance by banks for individual plantations, but you have seen that gradually shifting towards more general corporate finance on the corporate level for the groups, and also a larger role for the capital market. So many of the palm oil groups have gone to the stock exchange, have issued shares, have issued bonds, and much of their financing is coming through that avenues, which makes it more difficult to pinpoint the role financial institutions are actually playing with respect to actual deforestation on the ground, because you cannot link them very easily anymore to a specific plantation, which does not mean that it's not happening. I also refer to what Ruth was saying about Cargill and ADM and the other big traders financing. Well, yes, they are financing, but they are financed themselves as well. They also are issuing a lot of bonds and so on to raise this capital, which they can use to finance farmers. So financial sector, financial institutions play a big role in financing these developments, but they are increasingly moving away from the field, and which makes it more difficult to really assess their their importance and their responsibility. So I think this it's not really a question; it's just more a challenge which we have to a challenge also for the financial institutions themselves, but also for the outside world trying to look at it, how to assess it and how to look at this responsibility and how to try to move it in a responsible way.
No, it's a great point, and I'm going to ask Ruth to respond to it in a minute.
Yeah, hi, my name is Bill Barclay. I'm from the Rainforest Action Network. Just to follow up on Eric's comment earlier about this workshop statement in Jakarta, it was a group in July, 35 civil society organizations, mostly from Malaysia and Indonesia, and looking at palm oil finance and what expectations groups that are working on the ground there would like to see from the finance sector. I have some extra copies, so I'll be in the back of the room when this is over if people want a copy. My question is to you, Hilda. Public pension funds, how common are these ethics councils? And do you have mechanisms for distributing the reports and the briefings that you do more widely with the public and but also amongst other pension funds?
Great, thank you. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask the gentleman in the back with the wonderful hat he's had his hand up for a long time. And that's going to be our last question, and then we'll reflect back on the panel and bring this to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Juan Carlos Hintiach. I'm sure indigenous people from the Amazon, Ecuador. I'm here to represent the indigenous organization from the Amazon Basin, COICA. I have one comment and the second question is specifically for the gentleman from the Bandes, the Brazil Bank. My question is, are you concerned that in the Amazon people we are living like 3 million people around in display in 9 countries in the Amazon Basin and also I would like to hear the life don't have any price. We're living there and we have some territories and we need to think right now how is the challenge to have this dialogue directly with our own territories. According to some governments have signatories and instruments, international instruments. So according to this, my questions for the guy from representing the bank in Brazil is, do you know there's a policy about social concerns, policy about social instruments to be more applicable because we don't have any channel to talk with the bank. And you are just supporting the private sectors, supporting some governments that are tentative with instruments in indigenous people rights in our territories. So we need to evaluate that and we need to have a real deep discussions about this. Financiers is good for everyone, but not for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that will be our last question. I apologize if anyone had some burning questions, but I think we have to start to bring this towards a close. I see the clock is ticking. Gabriel, I'm going to turn to you first in terms of responding. There's a specific question there about engagement and dialogue and how we engage with our external stakeholders. It picks up on the points that were made up here in the front as well about the dramatically increased transparency, visibility that's out there because of information technology, the ability for people to see what our activities are as a financial institution out there on the ground. That means we all have to step up to the challenge of engagement. Can you talk a little bit about how BNDES is doing that? And then we'll come down the line. As you come to the end of your comments, I think it's a nice moment to also reflect on what you've heard today and maybe bring it to a close, but you've only got about a minute and a half.
Thank you very much. I want to try. It's a challenge. In relation to what the bank is doing, trying to be more transparent and the declaration we have been talking to them and we're thinking about sign 2. It's very important. We are working with the integrated report to join all the information, not only financial information, but the whole packet of information of the bank and of our clients. We work very close with our clients. We have a specific policy, not only federal, there are some agents, control agents, they try to set specific policy and we follow this policy, but BNDES has his own policy too, to seek how our clients, what they are doing, and they need to check with their supply chain if they are doing well too. So we are integrating all this information. You are putting this on the whole, like a set of information, a big set of information, and to open to the society this more and try to bring more visibility to this kind of thing. And specific to the other questions, of course, we have to work more with the NGOs. The Amazon Fund is, again, is a good example. We have our products with the civil society. Of course, sometimes they are smaller products, but we work together with the states, municipalities, and we know that there is a connection between the communities, and we know the communities are very, very important. We know that they have their own policies. We need to develop more the small the production activities of these communities. But sometimes we do not have access to the whole bag of the problems. We know we can do better, and we are trying to do better. But sometimes not easy. You know, the bank is almost 95% of our employees in Rio. We're trying to work with our kind of partnerships. We are able to spread our analysis, capacity analysis. But we know that we can do more. That's our reflection. I think it's a reflection for all the institutions, all the banks. We know that society demands more information, clear information, more transparency. And the more we do, the more we know we have to move forward. That's our challenge today. It's a big bank, but sometimes it's hard to move. I think it's Ruth pointed at a very good. I don't know how much she knows of BNDES, but inside the bank, like we have different banks, different divisions, and some are more evolving, more concerned about some things, and the other divisions maybe are not so attached to the environment and social issues. So we are trying to do better in this kind of things.
Gabriel, thank you for doing a good job in a very short period of time.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Hilda, you had a specific question about how common is the Ethics Council. I think lots of calls from this audience for you to expand your mandate quite significantly, but again, bring it to a close.
Okay. There are not many councils around. Not like us. I know that the Swedish pension funds, they're a bit different structures from ours, have a council. But they don't have, I mean, we really have the resources also to do the research, and I don't know of anybody else who has that. Whether we are spreading the gospel, was that your next question? Whether we are, yeah. After the ministry has decided on our recommendation, they are made public. So everything what we have done and which has been published is available on our website, free to use for everybody who wishes. And we know that other investors use it. They will never say that to us, but this is anecdotal information and hearsay. You know, we know that he knows, and we know, and so on. And we know that NGOs use them, and probably also the companies themselves. So we often get calls from companies both before and after the recommendations have been published and to want to engage with us on the issues. My general impression is that there has been a lot of discussion about awareness rising, and that investors should be more aware of the issues, and I think that's very true. I also think that I think in the previous section there was somebody who said that red is about norm building. This is also about norm building. This is to make deforestation and the degradation of forest unacceptable, at least in some parts of the world and in some types of forests. And this requires that investors really build competence, and that they not only rely on the policies of the CSR policies and what is available on the internet and what they hear when they talk to the board, they really lead a knowledge of the ecological issues involved. And I think investors should build that knowledge. They should push for more transparency. They should ask the right questions, and they should be able to evaluate the company's answers. I think that would be an important driver to make deforestation actually a financial risk. Thank you.
Hilda, thank you. That's really practical. I like the way you brought out some very tangible points there at the end as we go forwards. Ruth, I'm going to ask you to pick up this question because I know you've talked about it in the past, about the similarities to the corporate sector supply chain and linkage down into investee companies, if you like, so following the money right the way to its endpoint, but also help us to close.
Yeah, so I guess two of the questions really how to put pressure on a very complex system, and also Andrew's question about making the business case for change. So I think what I would say is that my experience, which is now over a long period, is that most of these changes are gradual, and exactly as Hilda said, it's changing what we think of as normal is how we make change. So I don't think there will be a sudden change. People like to make money. There would probably be far more people in this room if we were saying how to make money out of deforestation than there are in a room saying how to stop money causing deforestation. So, but I think that we have made a lot of progress. One of the advantages of becoming middle-aged is that you can look back and see things. And one of the things that I think illustrates that, when we set up ProForest 13 years ago now, and we made our first website, and we had a list of our services, and one of the things we worked with was illegal logging. And I got an email or a phone call from an old Malaysian friend with rather murky business interests that said, "I'm so glad you finally realized that you make a lot more money out of illegal logging than legal logging." And so now we are much more careful what we write on our website. But I don't think I would get that phone call nowadays, because 15 years later, actually, illegal logging became much less profitable because of all the work people did with the FSC, with FLEGT, with procurement policies, investment policies. All of those different things have contributed to making illegal logging a lot less attractive than it was. And so I think it's the same thing. That's what we have to do with deforestation. So the answer is we are not going to win any huge instant battles. There's not one cause for all of this. But if we keep working all of the time, and as Francis said on the first day, we keep being positive about it, then I think we will continue to make progress.
Thank you, Ruth. Terrific. Eric, you're also going to conclude with us, but there was a question here about public sector sources and the role that public sector sources play in this debate. Can you talk a little bit about that as you bring us to the end?
Sure. Yeah, I think the forerunners, Duncan, the forerunners are sitting here in the panel. Generally speaking, government links, wealth funds do not appear to operate much different in terms of investing in the palm oil industry. It's worth noting that the Scandinavian pension funds, I come across them in the palm oil sector frequently, together with my own Dutch pension funds. That might be worth looking at. Do analysts know about the risks they're engaging in? I think very often not. We've conducted a survey together with climate advisors and Profundo earlier this year throughout the world, but also in Southeast Asia. And yeah, especially for analysts on the sell side, you often see the tendency to basically write down whatever the company tells them to write down and make a buy recommendation for a particular stock. On the buy side, the analysts will be more careful, of course. But those reports are not very often publicly available. I totally agree with Ruth. We need time and patience. This is a huge sector, a huge problem, but for sure, Ruth, 10 years ago, who was talking about oil palm, right? And it's a huge issue now, globally discussed. So great strides forward have been made already. And this finance sector, yes, it will change over time as well. And I'm really looking forward, last comment, looking forward to the closer connection between REDD work and REDD funds and all the work that's going on trying to slow down the deforestation. Thanks.
Fantastic, Eric. Thank you so much. I think what I hear in this audience and from this panel is a real sense of optimism. I have the sense that there has been change over the period of time that we look at this. I have the sense that the business case for change, this is a really important point, is being made, is starting to make its way through the system. And that there is this spirit of we can do things here. And many of the questions that you asked from the floor were about what about the positive side? We've been talking about the risks and the downside and those signals. And a lot of what we heard back from you was, hang on, there are real opportunities here. There are opportunities to invest in the positive side. Let's talk about that. And when I reflect on the red agenda going forwards, I think what I hear from all of us is there is engagement. We have an opportunity to shift this debate in a more positive and forwards-looking way. There are some concrete things that we can do about that, to share information better, get data into the flow better, and I think you're hearing that both from the panel and from the richness of what you've brought together. So thank you so much for your participation. It's just to me to now close and to thank all of our fantastic panel for their interventions over this session. Thank you all for your contributions and your participation. But Gabriel, Hilda, Ruth, Eric, thank you so much for a terrific session.